Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dinah. I work in communications for the Climate Council, and here with me is the wonderful CEO of the Climate Council, Amanda McKenzie, who will be talking you through the election, what it means for us, and the all-important issue of climate change, and where to next. Before we get started, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne, upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as extending that respect to the traditional owners of the land in which you find yourselves today, wherever that may be that you're joining us from. To begin, I want to just quickly run through the structure. So Amanda is going to kick things off by talking through some of her key thoughts and insights from the weekend's election and highlight areas where we feel we have a lot more work ahead of us in reaching the hearts and minds of more Australians. We'll then run a Q&A session. At the bottom of your window, you'll see a Q&A icon. At any point during this, you can click on that icon and type your question for Amanda. We have people monitoring those questions. And once we jump into the Q&A parts of the talk, we'll be getting to as many of those questions as humanly possible. And also feel free to use, there's a separate chat box where you can just generate discussion, provide insights or comments on what you're hearing throughout this webinar. This is the first time we've done a webinar of this size, so please do forgive us for any hiccups. And let us know if you have any feedback on the style and format of that as well. That would be wonderful. So Amanda, without further ado, I'll pass over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dinah. And thank you everyone who's with us tonight for making time on a Thursday evening. If Dinah and I are looking to the sides from time to time, that's just that we've got our computers on the side as well to take some notes to make sure we get across what we're hoping to get across tonight. So I wanted to just start with a few comments and I suppose acknowledge firstly that the election result was a shock to many people, including many of us at the Climate Council. I think we were all somewhat nervous about the result. And then when it was clear on Saturday night that the coalition had won without a comprehensive or really any credible climate policy, we were disappointed. And I think we've had setbacks in the past, and the 2013 election result, you might remember when Tony Abbott won, he was winning on a platform of undoing a whole lot of climate action. So that is arguably worse than what the election result now. It's a party that just doesn't have a platform but is arguing they do have a platform. But I think there was a real sense of hope that there was change ahead, and Labor had brought a pretty strong climate policy, particularly for domestic pollution, to the table. So we were looking forward to what that implementation of that policy might look like. So of course, we're not a partisan organisation. It doesn't matter to us who's elected, provided they have good climate policy. So for me, I woke up pretty deflated on Sunday, and I know many of us felt somewhat despairing and like we needed to dust ourselves off and get ready to be pushing for more action again. But what really struck me during the election was that climate change was such a huge issue. I feel like there has been, particularly the last 12 months, but it's been building for much longer than that, a sense of deep concern across the public that's cutting across all demographics, all parts of the country, and that climate change was one of the big issues this election. I think when then you look at the constellation of key marginal seats that made a difference, when there wasn't a big sort of sweep of change, it doesn't line up to show you that climate concern. And it has been easy for some to write off climate change, saying, oh, it didn't matter because, you know, the Labor Party didn't win. But I think it's actually more complex than that. And we can get into that during the webinar as to what we see as some of the reasons for why that happened. But with very little change in the Parliament, it's obviously very frustrating. But I wanted to just quickly reflect on other setbacks that we've experienced before. 10 years ago, the Copenhagen Climate Conference was billed as the pivotal moment globally in getting a global agreement on climate change. And if it didn't work, it was all over. I was at that conference at that time with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and we'd put in absolutely everything to our efforts on the ground, as had activists around the world. And the conference fell apart in the last 24 hours. And I remember watching the TV as Obama was jetting out of Copenhagen, feeling totally despairing, like, I don't know what I'm going to do next. Put so much into getting an outcome there. But obviously, when you look back on 10 years, we have come a huge way. So at that time, there was a couple of thousand solar panels on people's houses in Australia. Now there's over 2 million. At that time, renewable energy wasn't an issue at all in Australia. We've helped put it on the agenda, and in a really, really big way. And, there's a whole range of other ways in which we've come far, but obviously the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 was a big one that came out of that, the sort of ashes of the Copenhagen conference, a new agenda for building a much better and deeper agreement in Paris, and one that was more likely to be able to be implemented. So there is some hope we've had setbacks before, it's a rocky road. But the biggest problem after Copenhagen was that activists vacated the field. People got burnt out, upset, and just said, I can't better keep doing this, I need a break. And that's when the climate deniers really went full throttle. And we see that this week in the push for Adani, in those from the mining sector that are looking to derail the Queensland government's approach to climate change. So, and in a range of other ways. So we've got to be really careful that we stay on the field. So there's 3 things that the Climate Council is working on now. And, we obviously firstly need to do quite a bit of reflecting and thinking about what's happening, but we can't afford any moment really to pause. We need to be acting as well as reflecting. So there's 3 areas. One is we need to keep changing the operating environment for politicians, and think that the significant increase in concern about climate change has come from a few things, but the student strikes globally was one, the record-breaking summer, which we described as the angriest summer that was contextualised for Australians with extreme heat, so fruit cooking on trees in South Australia, and nearly 50-degree days in Port Augusta, as well as continental-wide heat waves, over 200 records broken. So it's really important that we keep doing that work of just putting climate change on the agenda and building the momentum, and that changes the operating environment for politicians. So Scott Morrison, Simon Birmingham, a whole range of others in the coalition have felt the need to say that they will revisit the climate issue. Arthur Sinodinos was talking about more renewable energy. It's clear that the coalition feels they need to respond to this. Whether it's sufficient is obviously another question, but it is on the agenda. And, the public really cared about it last week. They still care about it this week. It's just that the narrative is changing. So we need to be elevating voices right around the country, particularly doctors, firefighters, farmers, solar installers in areas that perhaps, particularly in those more conservative electorates, North Queensland's an obvious area, outer suburbs of most of the major cities, that perhaps don't see climate change as an immediate concern, or, for instance, in North Queensland, obviously the issue is Adani. We need to be working on our climate narrative. So we both, as I've already said, need to be continuing to talk about the problem and make sure that we're articulating that clearly in as local a sense as possible to make it clear why it's important. But we also need to talk about the economic costs of climate change. I think too often opponents of action get away with just talking about the cost of taking action. We need to make sure the cost of failing to take action is very clear. And we've started that work. We put out some work a week before the election showing that $571 billion would be wiped off the property market by 2030 if the coalition continues with their current approach. So we're working on that. And the third thing in this sort of narrative space is about imagination. We need to help people imagine what a positive future can look like when we're tackling climate change. So we're taking a group of journalists to Europe, to the UK to see black cabs that have gone electric, to see offshore wind turbines, to Germany to see the transition of a coal community in the Ruhr Valley, and to see some other large-scale solar going on. So that's sort of the piece of the narrative work that we've got underway. The second thing is working with people that are trying to get things done. So we're going to work with state governments, with local governments. We're already doing that, and businesses that are getting things done on the ground. A good example is our Cities Power Partnership, which is working with 100 local governments who are putting in place policies and projects to get down emissions, move to more renewable energy, etc. And then the third thing is we just need to keep this job of applying pressure to the federal government. So it's been, endlessly frustrating working for over a decade trying to get federal government action that can actually stick on climate change. So that's why we need to do it at all other levels of the community. But at the federal government, we are totally open to working with the federal government where they are serious about action that is positive, but where it's not, or it will push us backwards, we will be holding them to account. And we've had a history of doing that, calling out misinformation, decoding it for journalists, making sure journalists are asking the right questions, etc. So that's sort of a bit of a summary of my thoughts that are still coming together after the election, and a bit of thoughts on what our plans are going forward. But we'd love to hear your questions, and hopefully you've got lots of them.
I can see there's quite a few already, Amanda. And just for those of you that joined us late, you'll see down the bottom of the screen a Q&A button. So use that at any time to shoot questions across to us, and we'll do our best to get around to all the questions that we have coming via the Q&A button or via email. And there's also a separate chat button, and you can use that if you want to just provide some feedback or input, or have a discussion around anything that you're hearing that we're talking about today. So I'm going to throw to our first question. I guess, and this is from Matthew, who emailed this one through, and he was really concerned that the urgency of climate action was just lost in the election debate. That, we're looking at this national leadership or lack thereof for another 3 years without active discussion at that federal level. And so he's wondering how, when, where he can best invest his efforts to educate the larger community and try to accelerate action on that national level.
Yeah, Matthew, I think this is a concern for all of us, and it's certainly one of the things that's worrying me. I think that many people viewing this would have seen the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out last year, saying that we need to act very urgently, as they've been saying for 30 years, and that they put it as another sort of 12 years, now kind of more like 11 years, to get emissions drastically down. I think these dates are sometimes unhelpful because we've been hearing for a few decades now the next 5 years, the next 10 years are critical, but it's fair to say that it would have been better to take action yesterday rather than tomorrow. So I think I am worried that that's a big disappointment in the election, is that we don't have a federal government that's committed to strong action. That said, I think that the push towards a change in the energy market is happening regardless of the government. Renewable energy has just plummeted in cost so quickly that it is being taken up, and the work of business, local governments, state governments can do a lot to be driving that in the right direction. So it's almost that if the federal government continues in the same approach, what we need to do is cobble together an approach that hits on every other aspect of society. So we need businesses to be getting down their emissions and through their supply chain. We need communities, whether it's getting solar panels on their local school, or working towards working with their local council for EV charging stations. There's a whole range of things that can be done in local areas, but it's up to all of us to think about ways that we can take action within our sphere of influence. So what I often say to people is there's 3 things you can do. You can use your time, your voice, or your money. So you can donate to organisations like the Climate Council to do work on your behalf. And there's a whole range of other climate change organisations pushing for change. There's also, you could think about your money in terms of your super and the banks that you invest in, etc. as well. I think using your time, obviously we can all do things in our own homes, but that's not sufficient. We all need to be working together to create change. So whether that's in your sphere of influence in like your school or your business, your university, whatever it is, that working with the people around you to create change. So, for instance, community energy projects are thriving at the moment. Things like where communities have come together to do a bulk buy of solar panels, or to invest in a wind turbine together, to be putting energy on the ground. Like, it's not ideal. It'd be better if the federal government was pushing this ahead. But I think if the federal government is if the federal government continues to do nothing, then we need to do all this at a local level. If they continue to try and obstruct action, for instance, the NEG that was proposed last time, the National Energy Guarantee, we thought would drive action backwards. We need to be in that conversation and preventing that from happening.
So this one I have from Be Noble, which I assume is a nom de plume. And he or she asks, how can scientists and facts influence the agenda when the government ignores them?
That's a good question too. And we are in this area where it's been described as fake news and people choosing what facts they'd like to believe rather than thinking of facts as something other than opinions. I think, though, that facts are a really powerful part of the debate if you can create a level of credibility, like I think we've done here at the Climate Council and other organisations, whether it's, you know, the Bureau of Meteorology or the CSIRO. There's a reason that those bodies get attacked by climate deniers. It's because they are trusted by most Australians. And so that politicians may seek to, spin whatever information is coming through. And we have seen this, the emissions data that is released by the government. Angus Taylor has consistently said, you know, emissions are going down when they're going up by the government's own data. So I think that our job is to make sure that we've got a consistent set of facts that a whole range of other advocates can be relying on and know that they're accurate and credible and can't be attacked. So we try and do that by putting out all of our reports that are peer reviewed. And then we need to make sure that the people that are asking questions of politicians and writing about this that get read by the general public, so journalists, have access to this information too. So we try and make our information as widely available as possible to the right people that are playing a role in the debate. So I think that's the best way that we have currently to be making sure that facts are influencing the debate. And, you know, there are areas where I don't think people do appreciate the level of urgency yet, but in the last 5 years, we've fundamentally changed people's understanding of extreme weather from being something that's natural to now knowing that climate change is influencing those extreme weather events. So whether that's bushfires or extreme floods, etc. And can't underestimate how it's actually really hard to change public opinion on an issue in what is actually quite a short period of time, 5 years. And people's understanding is very different to where it was when Tony Abbott was elected, for instance. So I think we are doing that with facts. It's the unfortunate nature of it is it's time consuming, and that those that are advocating on climate change have so much less resources than those that we're against.
Well, just on that, point about resources, Linda Bates has asked a question relating to Clive Palmer. We couldn't escape Clive Palmer during the election campaign, and she says the coalition has been assisted by the millions of dollars that Clive Palmer, who's coal mining magnate for anyone who's not familiar, other independents and Conservative parties in Queensland spent on distributing misinformation. She's wondering, is it worth creating a coalition of climate action groups to share resources, funding and political action to match those Conservative forces and push back? What are your thoughts around that Clive Palmer factor?
Yeah, that's a great idea in terms of putting together our resources. So to give you some context, Clive Palmer dropped over $60 million on his advertising campaign for the election, and it was obviously effective to some degree. You know, he got a significant vote in Queensland that was channelled into the Liberal Party and helped Labor to lose a bunch of those seats. It actually didn't swing to the Liberals, they swung to One Nation and to Clive Palmer. And I think that narrative that he was pushing very strongly about Shifty Shorten got traction in many parts of Australia. So you can't quite quantify exactly what the impact was, but it goes to the tenor of the discussion on the election. So it was a really disturbing development to see a coal billionaire who's got a clear interest in the Galilee Basin making that play. And to give you context of that $60 million, the whole of the climate movement put together has less money annually to spend on their campaigns. So that's all of the groups, whether they're working on Adani or elevating understanding of climate change in schools. Like, it's just an enormous amount of money. So my view is that we are fighting with our hand tied behind our back because we just don't have sufficient resources. And after the election, the thing that's really solidified for me is I need to work out a way to at least double the budget of the Climate Council to allow us to do far more. So I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I'm been working on a strategy in the last few days while I haven't been able to sleep at night, thinking about how I can do that. And one of the things will be to go out to all of our supporters and say, can you double your donation? Can you get involved in a bigger way? Because we're really getting it to the pointy end of whether we're going to be able to take sufficient action on this. So, so it's a good point. How can we pool our resources to make a bigger impact? Because there's just we don't have the billionaires on our side at this point, but you never know. Maybe we could find one that was keen. Maybe they're online now.
And this is sort of a related question, but how many people support the Climate Council currently? What resources do we have available at our disposal, including the skills and abilities that we have?
Yeah, so the Climate Council is a $4 million organisation altogether, and about 16,000 Australians chip in either regularly or on a one-off basis per year, and that provides a lion's share of our funding. There's a few other philanthropists that are larger donors that contribute as well, and foundations, and that then makes up our funding. And that goes into all of our programs. So our core funding, the operational management of the organisation, it goes into programs like the city's Power Partnership that go to support 100 local governments around the country to do more on climate change. It goes to an initiative that Dinah here runs called the Climate Media Centre, which supports farmers, doctors, firefighters, solar installers, a whole raft of important voices, hundreds of them, getting out in the media on climate change. And it supports us putting together all of our research, so both the original and the synthesis research. So we've now put out over 100 reports. So we make our budget stretch pretty well. And in our team, we have experts in communications, in climate change science, solutions, and in working with local governments and a whole range of other skill sets. And then we have our councillors who work with us on a more of an ad hoc part-time basis, and they're all experts in their field in different areas. So you might have Tim Flannery, who's been an expert in climate change for a long time, or Will Steffen, who's a world-renowned climate scientist, or someone like Greg Bourne, for instance, who previously hailed from the oil and gas industry, but now is who then subsequently ran the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So expertise that go kind of across the range of climate change work in Australia.
There's one that I'll pick out from Rodney. It's relating to North Queensland. I think there's a few sort of questions coming through related to Queensland or Adani. He says, I think the issue in North Queensland is employment, which probably applies just as equally to Central Queensland. We need to promote practical transition strategies that encompass retraining, new employment opportunities. Adani is just one coal mine. There are many proposed in the basin, but what's the alternate employment opportunity for Queenslanders? Yeah,
well, this is so much the crux of the issue in North Queensland, and I think that we, in the sort of broader collective we of those advocating on climate change, haven't done enough to help to articulate what the future of that region can look like and what the other alternatives are. There's actually a whole range of large-scale solar projects in that region. For instance, 300 k's inland from Townsville, there's the Kidston project, which is both a large-scale solar installation as well as what's called a pumped hydro system. So in an old gold mine, they're using the water that's filling up that hole in the ground, essentially, to pump to higher areas. And then when they need the energy, they can let it go and it comes down. Sorry, that wasn't the best explanation, but it essentially works like a battery. So you have solar and a pumped hydrogen battery in that area, and there's a range of jobs in construction and operation of a plant like that. And there's a whole range of projects in the pipeline for regional Queensland. Regional Queensland has over 6,000 jobs in renewable energy now. But I think that story for that region of Queensland hasn't been told adequately. And it's not just renewable energy. It needs a plan for a whole range of different jobs. And some of them can be related to the climate change challenge, and some of them can be related to other things. But essentially, there needs to be a transition for people, and people need to see what would be the relevant skills that they could bring. I think an area like Townsville has experienced promises from multiple governments that haven't come through. So there's not necessarily a lot of trust when it comes to projects that they haven't seen before. So, a coal mine, people have seen it. They've seen people flying in and out to go and work in a coal mine. Maybe they've done it themselves. Whereas renewable energy projects, they probably know less people that have done that. So it's what I meant earlier about imagination. I think we need to help people to see what the future can be, and be respectful in terms of where they're coming from and the journey that they're taking. I've done some talkback radio, for instance, in central Queensland and in a number of the areas where there's support for the Adani mine. And I was really struck by some of the comments I've got a number of times, which I remember a coal miner ringing me and saying, look, I don't necessarily want to work in coal mining. I just don't see any alternative. Like, I worry about climate change for my kids, but that's long-term, and short-term, I need this job. So I think this is what you're saying with your question, is we need to have a clear transition. So one thing that we've been thinking about is whether we could go and do a bit of a listening tour up in North Queensland, and then potentially get together some of the people that are working on what's called just transition, and bring those people together in that area to try and nut out some policy that you'd hope could be bipartisan.
And I just should probably add that we also do a lot of work both with the farming community in Queensland, as well as the tourism industry, who are two major employers of Queenslanders, who also have a lot of interest and concern around climate impacts on their industries. So I'm just going to jump to a comment and question from Tom Hunt. Thank you, Tom. Given Vote Compass, which was ABC's tool for sort of evaluating how Australians were thinking and feeling, given Vote Compass showed 81% of Australians want more action on climate, and even 56% of identified Liberal voters said this, could the council take clearer initiatives to the government to actually help fill their vacuum of as yet unwritten policies around climate, and I assume energy as well, not to forget transport. He gives, for an example, a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend that costs so little to implement and sets the market in the right direction toward renewable energy.
Yeah, Tom, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is an opportunity, and I don't know Scott Morrison, but from what I know of him and what I've read about him, I've read that he is relatively pragmatic, and I think that, as I said earlier, the coalition needs to respond to the concern in the community about climate change. I think that climate change in some ways is a little bit similar to marriage equality. So, in the last election, the election before last, marriage equality was one of the issues that was arising, but it wasn't necessarily an issue that changed people's votes in that election. But it still was a thorn in the side of the coalition as they went forward. And obviously they had their internal debates around that, and the way that the policy was resolved was far from ideal. But eventually there was an outcome gotten to. So I think maybe climate change is a little bit similar, that it will be something that just doesn't go away for the coalition, and we'll definitely be trying to make that happen. Got a bit off track with the question though. What was the question?
It was, could we fill their unwritten?
So policy, yes. I think we can offer ideas, and I think we need to do this in coalition with a whole range of other players, because I think for the coalition, it's not just about talking about climate change. They want to talk about jobs. They want to talk about reducing power bills, etc. And I think we'd enhance our credibility to them with involving a range of other players that can speak that language.
This one is from Howard Witt. How do you intend to handle the problem children? That's what I'm determining them. So he's talking about the Murdoch Press, News Limited, IPA, Alan Jones, talkback host, and Peter Credlin, who currently has a show on Sky News.
Yeah, well, Howard, I hope you have a suggestion for this answer as well. There's a few things. One is that the first is we can make sure that some of our spokespeople in a much wider sense are available for Murdoch Press publications. So Dinah works with farmers, for instance, and ensuring that their voices are out there, and they have got some traction in the Murdoch Press. That said, obviously their editorial line is generally pretty contrary to action on climate change, but that varies slightly around the country. So I think that when you've got this sort of list of commentators that are generally really hostile to climate change, you just have to find as many other avenues as you can to connect with people. So whether that's all of the other media agencies in Australia, and, one of the big issues for climate change is media ownership, I think, like it is for any social justice or environment issue. But then also how we use social media. And I think one thing that was instructive during the election was just how well politicians like Pauline Hanson and Scott Morrison use social media to connect with their audience. So I think that it's not just the Murdoch Press that's highly influential, it's those channels where a politician can speak directly to their audience. And we have a digital presence. But a challenge we have is, unlike a corporation, of course, we don't have the money to advertise on our social platforms. So we have to be especially interesting. So we've been working on a new digital strategy to think through how we can be even better at doing digital into the future. We have, I think it's 350,000 or 400,000 audience on our various social channels. But I think we need to work out how to amplify that further into the future and position ourselves as doing that as well as anyone.
The next one is from Nick Goodman. So he quotes, I guess, not an uncommon argument that's used to justify inaction on climate change, and that is Australia won't make a significant difference to total world emissions by going 50% renewable, and this is referring to, China and other nations being much larger or having many more people, maybe currently even building coal-fired power stations. We're just a small player, so what does it matter? He asked, does the Climate Council have any evidence or an argument to counter that mistruth?
So there's a few things that I use to tackle that. One is with facts. And the first thing to say is that Australia is one of the largest polluters globally. Even if we don't think about ourselves as one of the largest countries, we're actually the 15th or the 16th biggest emitter in the world. And if you add our exports into the equation, we're about the 5th biggest in the world. So we're one of the top players internationally. There's roughly 200 countries in the world. And so if we're number 15 or number 16, there's a fair few countries around the world that are, emit a lot less than us. And so if we're arguing, we're too small to make a difference, then we're arguing basically 180 countries are too small to make a difference, which is just nonsensical. Obviously, if you're working on an issue that affects everyone needs to contribute. So Australia at an absolute level is a big contributor to this issue. But the second thing I often say to people that put this argument to me is, so are you saying that Australia should have no role when we're talking about global trade because we're relatively small compared to the United States or Europe or China? And they say, no, of course not. Australia needs to advance its interest on trade. Or how about security and terrorism? I suppose we should do nothing on that because, the other players are much bigger than us. Oh, no, we need to protect our security. Well, in the same way, of course, we should have a voice on whatever the international issue is, and climate change has substantive threats to our economy and our well-being and our environment. So we should be in the mix of countries doing it, even if we were small, which we are not. So hopefully that gives you some substance to go out and have that argument.
I have a question that's a bit left of field. That's, can Climate Council bring Greta Thunberg to Australia to help mobilise even more student action? Now, I will say that I'm pretty confident Greta doesn't fly, so it may take her a while to get here on a boat. But what do you think, Amanda?
Thanks, Mark, for that question. I think for those who aren't familiar with Greta, she's the Swedish student that set off this wave of student strikes around the world, and she's one of the most prominent activists at the moment. She's an amazing communicator and absolutely fantastic. So we would love to bring her here, but as Dinah says, she doesn't fly. So we could get her to speak via Skype or in another way. I kind of think she should do a global tour, just maybe a slow train across the world or something, because we'd love to hear more from her, and I think she's incredibly eloquent. But I think that there's a lot of Australian students that are also excellent communicators, and I know Dana and some of your team have worked with some of those school strikers to help them refine their message and ensure that they can get out there in the press too. And I'd really love to hear more from them. I think young people can often crystallise the issue really well into why it matters. And it's a real wake-up call for adults. So the student strikes have just been amazing.
So I have one that's sort of, again, a bit left of field, but it's just in relation to when people donate. And anonymously, someone has just asked, would you consider giving donors a choice as to how the money they donate is being spent? So, for example, direct action versus research versus study tours.
Yeah, it's a good point. We don't split it up on the website as to how you can donate to which particular project, but we often will send an email saying, would you like to get behind this particular initiative or that particular initiative? But it's something I'll go away and have a chat to our team about, whether we could have a project function on the website too, because I think that's an interesting point, because I'm sure some people would like to donate to some particular things rather than others.
This one is from Janet. She said, so many people are fussing about the cost of addressing climate change. It was obviously a very strong theme throughout the election campaign. So what can we do to emphasise the cost of ignoring climate change? Yeah,
again, an excellent question. During the election campaign, obviously, when Bill Shorten put out his policy, there was questions, well, what does it cost? And Brian Fisher did what we'd consider a relatively spurious analysis of that and put a number on it. But one of the challenges was Bill Shorten didn't put a number on it. So it led to, I think one of the key parts of the election was this issue of trust around Bill Shorten. And I think Morrison really leveraged that against him. But the more important issue is how do we emphasise the cost of inaction? And to date, there's been too little data to help us quantify exactly what the costs are. And because they tend to be future risks that are considered really quite far in the future, when it comes up against immediate action, it's always been a challenge to communicate. So we've been working on this big cost of climate change process, particularly looking at the impact of extreme weather and worsening heat and what that means. We've put out the first report on that on property values and on agriculture in the week before the election. It got heaps of media coverage. We measure media coverage in terms of the ad dollars that it generates. So it generated about $1.5 million of ad dollars. So if you'd had to pay the money for advertising, that's how much it generated. So that's quite a lot, not quite as much Clark Palmer, but for one report that was excellent, and it shows that there's a real interest. And the top line statistic was that by 2030 we could see $571 billion wiped off Australia's property market. And I think that really brings it home to people as to, this is going to cost you. And we were able to say in that report which postcodes were the most vulnerable, and get into some of the stats on the impact on agriculture as well. So that's only the first step in that project. We're going to do a whole range more work looking at other extreme weather events and the impact in different regions, and also seek to quantify it at a more and more granular level, because it's often a problem that, you might remember Barnaby Joyce with the carbon tax saying, it'll be $100 lamb roast. And we've never been able to quantify it to that level for the impact of climate change, partly because it would just be nonsense to do so. And we always put out true, reliable facts. So that's sometimes what we're up against. But I think you're absolutely right. We can do more on the costs, and that's what we're looking to do. And we've just got to get it out there as much as possible to ensure that people realise the economic impact of failing to act.
So I've got one from Matthew asking about how we can bridge the divide between skeptics, or those we might call deniers, and those who understand and really want to take action on climate change. He said he feels like there's polarising commentators on both sides of the debate, and that runs the risk of sort of paralysing each other or everyone. I guess this has been a really contested and polarizing space for quite a while. And where do you see that sort of bridge? Or
yeah, you're absolutely right. I think people do get paralysed and get sort of tribal about where they stand on the issue. I think that's been one of the key challenges for the coalition. Is I think a lot of members are ideologically find it very hard to come to a view that climate change is underway and happening if it was brought up by greenies. So it's sort of some pitted against the other. So I think our job is to listen, but we can't change everyone's mind. So if people are diehard skeptics, we're probably not going to change their mind. We need to work with people who are concerned but inactive to become more active, to heighten their concern. At the public polling that's been done over many years now, so hopefully it's got more credibility than the current news poll, has shown that the actual number of skeptics in Australia, so people that absolutely deny that climate change is happening, is very small. It's about 8%. Unfortunately, there are, those people are disproportionately represented in boardrooms and in our parliament, but a lot of those people won't be changed by information and facts. So there is some listening to be done with people that have some level of openness to change.
This one is just in relation to rural and regional Australia. So it's also from Rodney, but I have seen a few questions coming from people from farming communities and rural and regional parts of the country. And I think his sort of question maybe might shed some light for the others as well. So many in regional rural Australia, think about climate change as more of an urban Australian issue, a greenie issue. How can we engage regional Australians better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's partly the messengers that have been speaking on climate change have tended to be, policy wonks, people that are based in Sydney and Melbourne, people that don't have a good understanding of regional issues and maybe have haven't spoken well to people's understanding and needs in those areas. So I think one issue is just finding the right messengers, and the Farmers for Climate Action, for instance, is doing a great job of engaging farmers to go out and speak in rural communities. But also another initiative that we've got off the ground in the last few months is called Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. So that's been led by our councillor, Greg Mullins, who's a former fire chief. So he's brought together 23 former emergency service and fire chiefs. So they're very credible, and they're all over the country. And they're doing work in communicating, particularly in regional Australia, about the impact of climate change. So they can talk to another audience, again, that is impacted by bushfires and also extreme weather, and talk to them from where they're at as well. So I think one of the key things is get more messengers and make sure we have local messages about what the impact of climate change and the costs of failing to act will be.
Kirsty's just asked us, is there any chance you can do a dot point argument rebuttal cheat sheet for us? I could do with that.
Yeah. I hear you, Kirsty. I think a lot of people need, if you're at the barbecue and you're having a conversation with your uncle or something and you're getting peppered with all of these things, it can be good to have a cheat sheet. We have one on our website, which Elise can send around, called a barbecue guide, which goes through some top line myths. But what I'd also say is don't feel like you need to know everything. I think that this can get into, when it gets into a debate about facts, it can be really polarizing. Like, I heard this from this scientist, well, I heard this from a different scientist, etc. I think start with where, everyone can agree. Like, I think most people can agree that we pollute too much in the world, that humans are having some level of influence on the world that is unhelpful. Most people can agree that the future is renewable energy and more electric cars. So we don't need to get into a pitted debate with everyone about the detail of how much sea level will rise or it won't or whatever, or a variety of the myths, like even exactly what Australia's role is. We can say, well, is it worth us playing some role? And so just thinking about what the argument you're having and not necessarily, going head to head on each different issue, thinking about what may be able to engage them in perhaps a different way.
And just sort of a bit of a follow-on from that around language and how much it matters. And I've got a couple of people that have raised the fact that The Guardian has advised that their journalists are now going to change the way they talk about climate change. So rather than use climate change, they're going to use climate emergency, climate crisis, etc. Around the world, this term climate emergency has become more and more common. So over in the UK, they declared a climate emergency. We've actually also had a number of local governments in Australia do the same. And so people seem to be wondering, does the Climate Council plan to review the language it uses to convey the urgency of the situation? Or, you know, what language should we or shouldn't we use?
Yeah, Dinah's also done a lot of thinking about this point, so you might want to chime in too. I think we did see that The Guardian changed their language, and we use words like climate crisis quite frequently to some audiences. But I think in general, when you're doing communications, you've got to connect with someone where they are. And for a lot of Australians, I think the election illustrated this, is that you've got to meet them where they are and where their concerns whatever their concerns are. And if we were to go to many Australians with an idea of climate emergency, they'll just reject that outright. You know, you just have to look outside today in Melbourne, a beautiful May day. What's the emergency is what most people would be saying. You know, I can't touch or feel this emergency that you're talking about. So we often use crisis rather than emergency, partly for that reason. But then also, if we're talking to some audiences who are probably not with us, we wouldn't use words like that might be inflammatory or push them away. So we try and use language that is drawing people in and connecting with us. Do you want to add to any of that, Tana?
No, I think that really covers it. And just also, you know, the idea that there's like one word or one phrase that is going to convince everyone of something. It just, that no such thing exists. So while language does matter, I think there's room and space for different language to be used, like Amanda said, for different audiences. People are motivated by different things. And so when you use different types of language and you have different types of people talking to them or reaching out to them, that can be really motivating for one person. But if you tried the same with a different type of person who's in a different place, it wouldn't be as effective. So I think there's space to use some of those terms some of the time for some people. Just depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
So in terms of, we might need to wrap up soon. I will just pick out a final question, and then we might have to just wrap it up. So in terms of local action, you mentioned the Cities Power Partnership. Can you explain that just a little bit further for people?
Okay.
What is it and how does it work?
Okay. So the Cities Power Partnership, I think I mentioned at the start, it's a partnership of 100 local governments that we're coordinating, and we're seeking to gradually get as many local governments as possible around Australia. So I think that 100 represents over 7 million Australians, and we've tried to make it as diverse as possible. So it's from areas like Kalgoorlie up to Port Douglas, down to Hobart. There's a whole range of councils, from cities to bush to outer suburbs, regional areas, etc. So that project does a number of things. We provide a knowledge hub to councils to help them get across the types of projects they can get involved with. We ask them to sign up to 5 pledges to reduce their pollution. So it might be in renewable energy or electric vehicles, but it's tailored to whatever their geography and their resource base is. Then we encourage councils to connect with one another, and often across state lines, to other councils that are doing interesting projects so they can be learning from them, and to share that learning more generally with other councils around Australia. And we also bring out international speakers from time to time, for instance, to talk to councils about what's happening in other places. And then we support councils over time to implement their pledges. So that project's been going for almost 2 years. And so to have 100 councils on board so far has been amazing. It's the biggest local government climate project in Australia. And we do a lot of profiling of the councils once they've done their bit. So, for instance, the Lismore Council has just implemented a floating solar farm, for instance. We were up there helping launch that project, which is an amazing initiative by that council. Another one is the Strathbogie Council in Northern Victoria, who worked really hard to put together what's called the Bogie bulk buy. So that's a bulk buy of solar panels as part of a community initiative to both reduce household bills as well as get more renewable energy onto homes. So there's a range of really great projects, which gives a whole lot of good news stories about what's actually happening on the ground in Australia, and we think is really important in terms of getting things done and showing that the future is here. That sort of imagination piece I've been talking about, helping people see the solutions to climate change in their own domain.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out this evening to join us. It's been really fascinating to hear what's on your mind, what you're searching for answers for. Unfortunately, we did not get of questions that you sent, but we'll be endeavouring to email personal responses to each of you, and we'd also like to encourage you to get in touch if you have any further ideas or input on anything we've talked about tonight. You know, we always incorporate feedback and input from our community into our strategy and the work that we do. So be sure to let us know also if you'd like more webinars. But I'll just hand back to Amanda just to give us a bit of a wrap up or some final thoughts.
Yeah, to reiterate what Dinah said, thank you for your involvement tonight. It's been really interesting seeing the questions come through. And if you liked this forum, please let us know, because we'd be really happy to do more. And we'll get back to those who haven't had their questions answered with answers in the next, I'll say week. I think we can probably get it out in that time, but it will end up being less. So I mentioned in the discussion, working on our strategy and what comes next. So we'll be emailing that out in the next little while, in probably not all together, probably in bits and pieces as it comes together. And so there'll be room for input into that too. We do regular surveys. So, you know, very open to hearing ideas. And what else did I want to say? I suppose I just wanted to say at the end, like, just to emphasize that we're all in this together. I think it was for many of us, a shock and a disappointment on the weekend. And it is hard to regroup. I know we've had with our team here, we've had a bunch of sort of getting together, putting our heads together, saying, you know, okay, how are we feeling? Feeling pretty disappointed and feel like we're at the bottom of the mountain and there's so far to climb and we just need to get climbing, and we're still like convincing everyone that we need to climb. So, but I think what gives me sort of hope and motivation is, you know, it is a rocky road when you're creating large-scale social change. We have come a long way, but the only way that we've come far has been when we've done it together. And so I think we need to regroup, put our heads together and work out how to continue to push for change, but do it bigger and bolder and better into the future. So like I said earlier, I think our strategy will involve dramatically increasing what we do. And I think when I look back at what the work we did in the last 6 months, I feel like it was all the right sorts of things. There just needs to be more of it. And we're just too small a player, and I think we just need to increase our influence and impact. So I hope you'll be along for the journey, and like Dana said, if you like more of these sorts of things, let us know, and thanks for making the time to sit with us and have a conversation tonight.
Thank you, everyone. See you later.
Have a good night.